Rendlesham's final warning, the UFO that disabled America's nuclear arsenal. It didn't blink, it hunted. A thin beam slid along the weapons storage area fence like it was choosing. Radios fell to hiss, and 2 guards froze with fingers over dead alarms. If it wanted our nukes off, one whispered, it just showed us how. Then the base went still, except for the animals screaming in the dark. To see how it got there, go back to December 1980. Twin U.S. Air Force bases, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, sat on British soil with tactical nuclear weapons nearby. Names you'll hear again: Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, John Burroughs, Jim Penniston. Their stories don't agree, but the paper trail began with footprints. First night, the footprints in the clearing. The first call wasn't cosmic. Around 3 a.m., December 26, 1980, a security patrol near the east gate of RAF Woodbridge saw lights drop beyond the treeline of Rendlesham Forest. The Cold War was humming, nukes were behind the fence. Stepping off base at night with weapons was a career risk. They went anyway. Airman First Class John Burroughs moved under the pines with Staff Sergeant Jim Penniston and Airman Ed Cabansag, each breath showing white. The ground muffled their crunching boots. Ahead, through thin trunks, something pulsed, red, blue, white, like it was breathing. Stakes, in that moment, were simple and heavy. If it was a downed aircraft, lives were on the line. If it was an intruder, the base was compromised. If it was nothing, every minute they spent out here would be used against them. Their radios popped. Proceeding into the forest, one said, voice low. The response came back faint, like the trees were swallowing it. They kept moving. The light drifted, then tucked itself behind branches as if it knew how to use cover. Burroughs later said his legs felt leaden, like he'd stepped through heat. Penniston would say he closed to within touching distance. Cabansag's statement struck a different tone. What they'd chased looked like a beacon farther off than they thought. They broke into a small clearing. The light vanished. What remained were details that felt wrong in the cold. 3 shallow impressions in the frozen topsoil, forming a triangle, each spaced evenly, like a tripod had been pressed into the ground. Branch tips were snapped clean, not torn. Sticky sap beaded on bark where something had scraped. The men crouched and compared boot prints to the depressions, 2 even, 2 aligned. Marking the site, Penniston said, already sketching. He traced the 3 indentations, measured distances. The notebook would become its own riddle years later. Burroughs held his light, hand trembling hard enough the beam jittered. He'd remember the sound next, the shrill, tearing scream from somewhere across the fields, animals panicking like a switch had been thrown. 2 nights later, Halt would record similar animal distress on tape. They called Suffolk police around 4 a.m. Officers walked the treeline, saw nothing but the beam of the Orfordness lighthouse arcing every 5 seconds on the horizon. It's the lighthouse, one said. The airmen kept their place in the dirt anyway. By daylight, the team returned to the clearing. Frost rimed the ground. The impressions were still there, clearer now. 3 marks, each a few inches deep, pressed into the earth. They drew a triangle roughly balanced, not random stamping. Foresters and later skeptics would call them rabbit diggings. A Polaroid taken that morning shows a patch of scrub and disturbed soil, quiet, ordinary, and contested ever since. Under orders, a radiation survey meter, and then /PDR 27 was brought out later. Not that first morning. Those instrumented readings would come on the second night with Lieutenant Colonel Halt. But even here, the airmen were already thinking in terms of instruments and protocol. You can hear that in the way Penniston cataloged abrasions, the height of the sap marks, the angles pointing inward toward the supposed center. Back at the east gate, the debate started. It was the lighthouse. No, the cadence didn't match what they'd seen moving through the trees. You can't have close-in beams from a lighthouse, one security man said later on shift change. And what about the broken branches? The answer was a shrug. If this was benign, they could stand down and nobody lost face. If it wasn't, they were staring at an incident near nuclear assets in a forest owned by someone else's government. Meanwhile, Penniston's notebook filled. He sketched what he said he'd seen out in that tangle of pines. A wedge-shaped object with a smooth surface and etched symbols on a panel. Triangles and rectangles in tidy rows. None of the official statements from that morning mention him touching a craft. His claim would come later, years later, after the first wave of skepticism and the Halt Memo's restrained language hit the press. That delay would fracture witness unity, but in the cold clearing, the notebook already mattered. It made the moment anchor itself in ink. Burroughs didn't argue philosophy. He was shaking. He later described a haze, a kind of static screen in the air. His memory of how long they were in the woods never stabilized. Minutes? Hours? He'd carry that blankness into a long fight with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and eventually the VA would acknowledge in-service exposure to something during those dates. That's a thread we'll pull later. For now, it sat like a quiet weight behind his eyes as he stared at those 3 impressions. The night duty supervisors heard them out and filed it under unexplained lights. No siren, no base lockdown. The lighthouse theory was floated from the start. A simple story helps people sleep. But the forest wasn't done. Here's the part that sticks. The micro moments you only get from people who were there. A glove slipped off and hit the frost like a coin. A pencil snapped. Penniston swore, then turned the stub sideways to keep writing. Cabansag cupped his hands and called out into the trees, half expecting a response. Nothing came back but the soft rush of the North Sea wind. It might have ended there. While command wrote it off, the forest didn't. 3 nights later, the deputy base commander would walk back to those same 3 impressions with a microcassette recorder in his pocket. And this time, the tape would remember what the men couldn't. The lighthouse theory versus field observations. Back at the gate, the argument came down to rhythm. The Orfordness lighthouse threw a flash every 5 seconds, bright and mechanical, punching a corridor of light across the coast. If that's what they'd chased, it meant stand down, write it up, go home. If it wasn't, command had to escalate an intrusion near 2 NATO bases storing tactical nuclear weapons. Nobody wanted to be wrong in either direction. They tested it the way security cops do, by walking, by timing, by looking from multiple angles. Cabansag's statement later reads like a map. "We could see a beacon going around," he wrote, and they pushed toward it until the angle revealed a lit farmhouse near Capel Green, not a craft. The flashing beyond lined up with the sea and the lighthouse. That's one version, written within days. But the men who'd been in the trees kept talking about movement. Not flash movement, not the steady sweep of a light on a tower, but a glow that slid behind trunks, dipped low, then lifted in a way the lighthouse couldn't. You hear the split in the ranks, the ones who felt fooled and the ones who felt watched. Duty required they assume benign until proven otherwise. Pride made that easier. Line of sight checks became a ritual. Guards on later shifts stood near the east gate and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, waiting for the pulse. It came, exactly as promised, knifing through the damp air. "That's it," someone said, the relief almost a command. But when they traced the first night's path through the forest, the cadence didn't fit what they remembered. Clothes and beams, a white spill that seemed to reach through branches and pick a spot, as if aimed. The next morning's physical trace didn't sit cleanly in the lighthouse box either. 3 evenly spaced ground impressions, sap drops, matched height scrapes pointing toward a center. Those are up-close details, not horizon effects. Skeptics would later call the impressions rabbit diggings, and the scrapes ordinary forestry scars. Foresters who walked the site agreed the marks could be natural. The airmen didn't buy it. They'd seen neatness in the pattern that felt designed. Meanwhile, the question of escalation hung over the radios. If you declare an unknown airborne object near a base with nuclear munitions, you trigger a cascade. Lockdowns, logs, cross-notification to the Ministry of Defense. If you say lighthouse, life keeps moving. The night duty supervisors used the lighter word, unexplained lights. No alarms. No formal intruder report. The first night ended as a problem of perception, not policy, leaving stress to steepen the people who had to stand those posts again. Off shift, the debate turned human. Some of the security police ribbed Burroughs and Penniston. "You chased a lighthouse," they said, half laughing, half warning them not to make a career out of it. Others pulled them aside and asked about the scream, about the weird calm that fell after, about radios that sounded like they were talking through wet cloth. Those questions lived in the gray space between ridicule and respect. Fear sits there, too. Back in the forest, the physical geography stacked the odds toward confusion. Pine rows create straight corridors that trick the eyes. Distant strobes find gaps and appear closer than they are. But the men kept pointing to one thing you can't fake, proximity. When you're under trees and a light seems to reach you, not just bathe the horizon, your body knows the difference. They held on to that, to check the cadence for themselves. Some walked to the farmer's field at Capel Green and turned to face the sea. 5 seconds on the dot. When they stepped back into the woods, the flash broke, scattered by branches, felt different. That contrast became a talking point. In the open, the lighthouse ruled the night. in the trees, something else had moved. Command didn't change posture. The official story stayed neat, ready for any inspector. Patrol misread coastal lights, no threat, base secure. That was enough, until it wasn't. 3 nights later, when Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt took a small team and a radiation meter back to the impressions, he brought a microcassette recorder. He wasn't going to argue cadence, he was going to capture it. The stalemate was about to break, not in a briefing room, but in the wind and the breath of men counting seconds in the dark. Halt takes over, the tape starts rolling. Saturday night, December 27th, 1980 turns into the early hours of the 28th. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt is at an officer's dinner when a young lieutenant leans in and says, "The UFO is back." Halt excuses himself, drives to Bentwaters, changes, then heads to the forest. He isn't out there to gossip. He's the deputy base commander, and he carries a Lanier microcassette recorder for notes. Tonight, that recorder will archive breath, wind, and the limits of certainty. He starts where the first night left a scar, the little clearing with the 3 ground depressions. You can hear the wind spill over the mic, 150 feet or more from the suspected impact point. He says, steady clipped. The light-all floodlight won't cooperate. Can't get the light-all to work. Send back and get another. On the radio, security traffic crackles. Bustinza calling security control. Names and jargon anchor the tape in the base's living system. And in the minds of men who know that calm voices are how you keep hands from shaking. A Geiger counter comes out, and /PDR, 27, standard issue. Sergeant Monroe Neville's, chemical defense instructor, handles it, unfamiliar enough that his learning curve leaks onto the tape. Minor clicks, he tells Halt at first. They ease toward the indentations. Can you read that on the scale? Halt asks. Neville shifts ranges. We're now on the 5/10 scale. The numbers aren't dramatic, but they matter because they're numbers. Right at a half of a millirem. Neville says in one moment Halt will later point to. In plain terms, around 0.07 milliroentgens per hour at the best point, slightly above their background sweeps of 0.03 to 0.04. Halt narrates as if for a future reader. Here's the center. Here's an abrasion on a tree. I've never seen a pine tree that's been damaged react that fast, he mutters, noticing sap marks that gleam like sequins in the flashlight. The tape captures microordinary life too. A burst of piano music accidentally recorded over at home later, his daughter in another room. It's human, messy, and impossible to fake in retrospect. They circle, counting clicks, dragging the meter close to the ground, then up tree trunks. Up towards 7, just jumped up towards 7/10, Bruce England says, the lieutenant who found Halt at dinner now guiding him around the site. Halt calibrates the moment, 7/10? Right there in the center? The readings don't scream danger, and Halt notes it. We're still comfortably safe here. But the pattern is clear, center, tree abrasions facing inward, a triangle that behaves like a map. The tape isn't a straight run. Halt admits later he kept clicking it off to save the 20-minute side. That's why there are jumps. He's trying to preserve tape for when it matters. 2/3 of the way through, it pays off. England breaks the routine. He sees a flashing light through the trees, in line with a farmhouse to the east. Halt's voice tightens, then evens. There it is, there it is. They time it. Every 5 seconds, a pulse. That cadence is the Orfordness Lighthouse's signature, skeptics will say. In the moment, the men note the alignment and keep watching. Then the light seems to move, drift higher, break into multiple points. There's 3 of them now, someone says. Star-like lights, Halt will write later. 2 to the north, 1 to the south, about 10 degrees above the horizon, consistent with bright stars near the horizon such as Sirius. The brightest hovers, then beams down a stream of light from time to time, as his later memo phrases it. On tape, you hear the breath spike and the diction tighten, as if the body knows when something breaks the pattern. He toggles between description and command. Keep the floodlight off, he orders at one point when they worry about losing night vision. He keeps the chain listening. You can hear radios in the background, Security 6, East Gate, light all requests. Nervous humor slips out in half-lines that don't land as jokes. They're there to steady hands more than to be funny. When the pencil beam shows Halt's words, it's quick and narrow, a shaft that seems to mark the ground at an angle. The men react in real time. It's coming this way, Halt says into the recorder, a sentence that puts a weight in the throat even decades later. The meter clicks don't spike like a danger meter in a movie. They rattle at their modest pace, indifferent to drama. The contrast makes the tape feel more honest. This is the moment the tape becomes a battleground. Supporters point to voice stress, breath rate, the specific cadence of 5-second flashes, then splitting lights, then beams, an arc that doesn't sit neatly on a lighthouse alone. Skeptics answer, optical effects, stars near the horizon, Sirius to the south, atmospheric twinkle, and men primed by the first night to read meaning into flashes. Halt's own later recollections grow more dramatic than his original tape. The tape is the anchor. It keeps yanking everything back to wind, clicks, and short sentences. Meanwhile, something else is brewing off tape. In the background of the chain, near the weapons storage area, guards will later claim they saw narrow shafts of light come down, tracking positions. Radios reportedly died. Alarms reportedly didn't answer. There's no official log to hand us here. But on the tape, Halt marks beams and direction, and the timing brushes the same window those guards talk about. The parallel is unnerving, even if it's only circumstantial. Halt doesn't declare aliens. He narrates. He notes. He keeps the recorder alive until there's nothing left to capture but wind and the sound of men deciding whether to escalate. When he heads back to write the memo, that restraint will follow him. Unexplained lights, it'll say at the top. But before the paperwork, the tape closes on breath and the 5-second heartbeat of a coast light arguing with whatever else moved through those trees. The weapons storage area, reports of beams. While Halt's team was tracing clicks in the pines, something else was unfolding where the base could least afford ambiguity. The weapons storage area at Bentwaters, the fenced heart of tactical readiness. Concrete revetments, layered sensors, patrol routes drilled into muscle memory. This was where mistakes ended careers. It's also where guards later said the lights didn't just appear, they acted. Start with the stakes. Those bunkers were part of a NATO war plan, and any intruder in that airspace, human or not, forced a chain of responses nobody wanted to trigger without certainty. You don't call possible compromise on a hunch. You also don't ignore a narrow shaft of light that seems to pick out a fence line like a finger. The accounts don't come from an official incident log. There isn't one we can point to. What we have are converging recollections from guards who worked nights, some speaking decades later but aligning on key beats. A thin beam, pencil narrow, probing along the perimeter, radios that went to static, a quiet that felt engineered. According to these men, a red-blue source above the treeline cast a concentrated bar that moved, not like a flood, but like a searchlight scaled down and precise. One young sergeant, knew enough to still worry about how he sounded on the net, reportedly hit his push to talk and got nothing but hiss. He moved 2 steps, the beam followed, then stopped on the fence stanchion at his 2 o'clock as if tagging a coordinate. Training says escalate to alarms. He reached for the panel. Dead glass. Another guard at a different position tried his handset and felt the strange lag of a carrier that refuses to catch. 2 isolated malfunctions? Maybe. Simultaneous? You can hear why the rumor mill called it switched off. Here's where the timeline brushes Halt's tape. On that recording, his voice tightens a hair when he says, "It's coming this way," then notes a pencil beam from the bright object. He's miles from the bunkers and not looking at a panel, but the description matches the guard's language with uncomfortable precision. Same night window. Same odd behavior, light that seems to know where men are. What we don't have, a formal blotter entry saying beam impacted WSA, or a maintenance ticket for a dead zone outage. Security culture explains part of that. If nothing ultimately breached, if the alarms came back when the moment passed, if supervisors judged it a transitory anomaly, the safest paper trail is the one that never leaves a drawer. Maud's stance on Rendlesham, no defense significance, didn't exactly invite detail. Still, the human pieces lock in. One guard remembers counting under his breath, 1, 2, 3, timing a flash cadence he'd later hear argued about as Lighthouse spill. He didn't care what the horizon did. He cared that a sliver of light crossed his boot and settled on the padlock seam of a gate he'd checked an hour earlier. Another talks about the way the compound sounded wrong, the hum of electrics seeming to recede like someone turned down a fader. There's a version of events where all of this lives in. The realm of perception under stress. Cold nights, adrenaline, expectation primed by chatter from the woods. Add the rhythmic dominance of any bright light at sea and radios that can and do fail, and you can write it off. The trouble is, when separate people in separated towers talk about the same narrow illumination tracking positions, the pattern gets harder to flatten. If a craft, or whatever you want to call a bright object that throws a controllable beam, demonstrates that it can interact with a weapons area at will. It isn't just theatrics. It's a message to the only audience that matters, the command post. It says we can reach in without touching, and your procedures can't stop the reach. No shots fired, no footprints to measure, just a memory of being seen in a place designed to see first. Years later, some of those guards would tell their pieces to researchers who specialized in nuclear-adjacent incursions. Malmstrom, 1967, Loring, 1975, Minot, 1975. The same motif kept surfacing: proximity to strategic assets, lights that perform, systems that hiccup at exactly the moment you most want them to behave. Skeptics point out that rumors travel faster than logs and that memories spool out under the weight of stories told often. Fair cautions, but even caution has to account for why these recollections rhyme. A detail that tends to stick: the moment the radios came back. It wasn't gradual, they say. It was like a door unlatched, carrier tone returns, panel lights nibble to life, a supervisor curses softly in relief. On the tape side of the base, Halt's breath steadies after the beam passes. In the WSA, a young sergeant lifts his finger off the dead switch and hears it click like it matters again. Command didn't write beams that night. Halt didn't either when he typed "Unexplained lights" atop his memo. But he captured the word "pencil," and the guards carried the rest in the space between regulations and sleep. If someone wanted to prove they could quiet the heart of a nuclear store without leaving a trace, this was a rehearsal you'd run. The rumor of that rehearsal spread off shift, quiet at first, then louder in kitchens and cars. It's the rumor that survived the paperwork. The Halt memo: what's in, what's missing. Back at his desk, the wind traded for fluorescent hum. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt chose his words like they might be weighed later. The memo he typed is dated January 13, 1981. Title line: Unexplained Lights. Addressed to the UK Ministry of Defence. Not classified. That matters. The paper trail starts conservative, not sensational. He anchors time first, and this is where the first hairline crack appears. The first night is listed as December 27th, the second as 29. The events themselves were the early hours of the 26th and the 28th. 2-day slip. It's plausible fatigue, and the holiday calendar did that, and later even the mod would concede the delay could explain errors in dates. But dates are what skeptics grab first. Then the content: spare, careful, and, if you were out there, almost unfairly calm. Halt writes that around 0:30 hours, a patrol saw unusual lights descending into the forest. Upon investigation, they found a glowing object, metallic in appearance with colored lights. Animals on a nearby farm went into a frenzy. He notes the morning return to the site. 3 small impressions in a triangular pattern: burn marks, broken branches. He doesn't use the word landing. He doesn't use the word craft. He lets Unexplained do the work. For the second night, his own night, the memo tracks what his tape caught in breath and wind. Radiation readings with an N/PDR 27, approximately 0.07 milliroentgens per hour at the best point. Background elsewhere 0.03 to 0.04. He records a flashing red light to the east, roughly in line with a farmhouse. Yes, that same line skeptics later married to the Orfordness Lighthouse. He describes 3 star-like objects, 2 to the north, 1 to the south, about 10 degrees above the horizon, with the brightest beaming down a stream of light from time to time. It's clinical, almost detached. He signs it C.I. Halt Lieutenant Call, USAF Deputy Base Commander. What's not there is louder than what is. There's no mention of beams on the weapons storage area. No claim that radios died on the perimeter. No hint that any security system faltered at the bunkers. If you only had the memo, you'd believe the action stayed in the forest and above open fields. The tightest description, pencil-like beams, lives on the tape, not in the typed summary, and even there it's a passing note, not a headline. He also doesn't mention Jim Penniston's later claim of direct contact. There's no reference to symbols, to a panel, to a touch. That silence aligns with the original witness statements from the first night, taken within days, where Penniston describes lights and a distant beacon, but not physical contact. In other words, the memo reflects the record as it then existed, not the story as it would grow. Why the restraint? Career math sits on the page. Call it a craft, and you're on the hook for explaining why your base didn't scramble every asset. Call it Unexplained Lights, and you've fulfilled duty without inviting disaster. The mod's later posture, no defense significance, slides neatly into that frame. David Clark, who sifted the department's file years later, found no in-depth UK investigation beyond internal correspondence. No hidden annex. No second, secret memo expanding on beams at the WSA. If such a document exists, it hasn't surfaced. Halt's own voice would shift with time. By 201, in a notarized affidavit, he said he believed the event was extraterrestrial and covered up. He's explicit. Beams fell near the weapons storage area. He'd say radar picked up something. But when you map that back to 1981 paper, the official language doesn't carry it. The memo is a floor, not a ceiling. This gap, memo versus memory, became the battleground. Skeptics point to the 5-second flash rate matching Orfordness, and to the modest radiation readings as unremarkable. Supporters point to the specific, recurring details across sources. Animals in frenzy on both nights, ground impressions in a triangle, the stream of light language consistent with the pencil beam on tape, and independent guards describing shafts on the WSA perimeter the same night. Both sides can cite the memo. One calls it thin, the other calls it honest. There's one more consequence of what Halt chose not to write. By omitting anything nuclear adjacent, he kept the story local. Unexplained lights in a forest is a curiosity. Beams selecting a fence line at a nuclear weapons area is a strategic problem. The memo never crosses that line. But elsewhere, over other fields and under other skies, similar lines were already being crossed, and those reports would force the Rendlesham file to be read differently. To see the pattern, we have to leave the forest. Nukes and UAPs, a recurring pattern. To see how a beam over a bunker becomes more than a local mystery, you have to look where the stakes are highest. Across oceans and years, the same kind of story keeps surfacing near nuclear assets. Lights arrive. Systems falter, or are reported to. People who don't want trouble end up reporting trouble anyway. Start with Montana. March 16, 1967, Malmstrom Air Force Base, Echo Flight. 10 Minuteman missiles drop from strategic alert nearly simultaneously. The official report calls it a shutdown with no-go indications, maintenance dispatched, missiles back online within a day. In the margins, rumors spark, guards talk about strange lights, a red object at the gate. Decades later, retired USAF officer Robert Salas goes public. Skeptics counter that investigations found no UFO connection and point to mundane causes. The record you can hold says the missiles failed together and no official link to a craft was made. The oral history says lights were there when it happened. Those two lines don't intersect on paper, but they run close. Move to Maine, mid-1970s, Loring Air Force Base. Security personnel report unidentified helicopters or lights near the weapons storage area over several nights. Alerts, scrambles, nothing caught. Then Minot, North Dakota, incursions, radar blips, visual lights. Different bases, different winters, the same pattern. Proximity to nuclear stockpiles draws activity that behaves like it's testing fences without touching them. Here's where Rendlesham stops looking like an isolated forest tale and starts to fit a template. At Bentwaters/Woodbridge, you don't have a launch control center going dark. You have guards near concrete revetments saying a narrow shaft of light tracked positions and panels felt dead. On Halt's tape, you hear a pencil beam. You hear breath jump when something bright seems to mark ground. In Montana, crews later describe an eerie, simultaneous failure across hardened sites. Different systems, same feeling. Control ceding to something outside the checklist. The human factor repeats too. Missilers, cops, commanders, people who live by procedure, wrestle with how to tell it. If they go too far, they risk careers. If they say nothing, they live with the gap between what they saw and what the log will bear. That's why the language trends cautious, unexplained lights, anomalous indications, no defense significance. Meanwhile, in kitchens and reunions, the stories get told with the words they didn't type. Skeptics push back hard. They point to atmospheric optics, to planets, Sirius low and bright, Mars misread, to radar angels, and to the fragility of memory stretched over years. At Malmstrom, they note official findings denied any UFO link, and that power anomalies happen. In Rendlesham, they track the 5-second cadence to Orfordness, and they're right about the cadence in open sight lines. The question is whether cadence explains the close-in effects, the triangle impressions, the inward-facing abrasions, the pencil beam, the guards' dead radios in the same breath. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Patterns don't prove intent, but they draw a shape. The shape looks like this: approach nuclear asset, demonstrate selective interference or presence, Withdraw without a footprint you can take to court. It's a deterrence lesson delivered to the people who hold the keys. Show the off switch, then leave. You don't need to damage anything. You need them to know you could. The cost lands on people. John Burroughs carries health issues into a fight with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and years later the VA acknowledges in-service exposure tied to those dates, citing classified records. That's not a press conference. It's a bureaucratic line item that says something physical happened to a human near those bases. It doesn't tell you what. It does widen the circle of consequences beyond misperception. Back to the fence line in Suffolk. If the beam reports at the weapons storage area were nothing, they were strangely consistent not just across Bentwaters guards, but across time and bases. If they were something, they fit a quiet campaign we still don't have a vocabulary for. Either way, the effect is the same. Commanders learn to read a message they can't acknowledge publicly. Halt writes Unexplained Lights, and the mod shelves it as low priority. In North Dakota and Maine, similar phrases pad similar files. That's how institutions protect themselves from questions they can't answer. There's a harder read. Maybe these aren't messages at all. Maybe they're probes, systems testing, mapping response times, logging blind spots. The difference between a demonstration and a rehearsal is whether you're the student or the target. The people in the towers don't get that choice. They get a night when their radios hiss, when a sliver of light finds a lock, when they count to 5 and hope the world stays ordinary. Patterns don't solve Rendlesham. They make it heavier. When the forest goes quiet and the tape clicks off, you're left with echoes that match other places where nuclear plans sleep. That echo is the recurring pattern. It's why a quiet craft near loud weapons keeps showing up in the same chapters of different histories. Penniston's binary, message or misdirection. Here's where the story tilts. Years after that cold walk, Jim Penniston put something new on the table. Not just a sketch of a wedge and symbols, but pages of ones and zeros he said flooded his mind the night of the clearing. He called it a download. He said it wouldn't let him sleep. Stakes first. If those digits mean anything, the event shifts from intruder to communicator. Not a threat display, but a message. That jump matters because it changes motive, and motive is what turns an incident into a doctrine. But it also raises a hard question. Why didn't this appear in any 198 paperwork? Penniston's account. After he touched what he believed was a craft, symbols on a panel lit, geometric, crisp, and when he got home, the digits started forming when he closed his eyes. He wrote through the night, then more nights. The notebook surfaced publicly decades later. Critics immediately circled the timeline. In the original statements from December 198, there's no claim of physical contact or a binary stream. In fact, his own early words lean toward a distant beacon and a farmhouse light. The gap is a canyon. What's inside the digits? Advocates say when parsed as 7-bit ASCII, the strings produce a short, odd phrase, exploration of humanity, plus sets of coordinates. Those points land on places with mythic pull. The Great Pyramid, Nazca, Sedona, High Brazil, a spot in the Atlantic tied to an old mariner's legend. It's the kind of list that lights up television producers and makes archivists frown. He took ridicule for it. Some friends pulled back. Others urged him on. He doubled down. The symbols he sketched that night matched the later binary header. The coordinates weren't random. One fell near a Cold War signals node. That last claim edges close to confirmation by suggestion. If you toss a net wide enough over military geography, you'll catch something. Still, the overlap kept believers hooked. From the human side, you can read his persistence 2 ways. 1, he's telling the only truth that makes sense to him, and time gave him the language to frame it. 2, memory bent under pressure, and a story grew where a gap hurt. Neither is comfortable. He was a ranking NCO with responsibility for security. He knew chain of command and reputational cost. You can hear that friction in his interviews, defiant, then tired, then defiant again. Let's separate what's attested from what isn't. Attested. His original 198 statement references a beacon and a lighthouse alignment. His notebook from the time contains sketches and symbols. Halt's memo and tape do not mention a landed craft. No contemporaneous document records binary. Not attested, but claimed later, physical contact, the download, the cipher yielding message and coordinates. There's a third path people miss. Maybe the binary is exactly what he says, an intrusive mental artifact from an encounter that scrambled more than perception. Or maybe it's a post-event narrative engine, an attempt to impose structure where the night refused to provide it. Trauma does that. So does attention. Once cameras show up, pressure changes memory. According to later analyst write-ups, some coordinates resolve with surprising precision. Others sway with interpretation. ASCII parsing requires choices about grouping and start points. Shift the frame, and you get different text. You can call that flexibility, or you can call it fragility. Either way, it weakens the claim that this is a universal, robust message. Meanwhile, the binary's existence muddies witness convergence. Burroughs fights the VA over health impacts tied to the dates. He wins an acknowledgement of in-service exposure based on classified records. Halt leans on his tape and memo. Cabansag's early statement anchors the Lighthouse cadence. Penniston's evolving account pulls eyes off the forensics and onto a code that might be a Rorschach. Here's the practical impact. The binary keeps the case alive in popular culture while giving skeptics a clean lever to pry at credibility. It also risks eclipsing the strongest evidence: the tape's real-time stress, the measured radiation uptick, the WSA beam claims, under a narrative that requires leaps. But there's one detail you can't dismiss. Penniston wrote something in a notebook right after the event, and that notebook shaped his life. Whether those later digits were message or misdirection, deliberate or emergent, they became his way of carrying that clearing forward. And in a story full of silences, a man choosing ink, again and again, says as much as the code itself. Forensics of the Halt Tape. The tape is the one thing that doesn't change its mind. Wind noise, breath, clipped phrasing, those textures don't bend years later. Analysts start there. They map the ambient gusts against local weather in the early hours of December 28, 198. The match is close, steady cold wind, occasional harder pushes that rattle the mic. That sets the stage. Then they listen to bodies on that stage. Halt's voice stays measured until it doesn't. You can hear when description becomes reaction. Early on, he's procedural, distances, instrument ranges, positions around the triangle of impressions. Breath is even, sentences clean. When the flashing light appears in line with the farmhouse, his cadence tightens. The 5-second rhythm enters the room, and you can time it with him. That's the Orfordness signature skeptic's sight. Fine. The tape logs it. The question isn't whether that cadence exists. It's what happens after it's established. Here's where the physiological markers matter. When Halt says, "It's coming this way," his breath rate bumps, then steadies into short bursts. You can chart it. Inhale spikes, exhale clipped. It's not performance. It's the body calibrating to a perceived approach. A few beats later, when he uses the word pencil, describing a narrow beam, the room tone shifts. Men move, clothing scuffs, someone's voice jumps a half step. Stress is contagious on tape. The instrumentation cross-checks sit in parallel. Sergeant Monroe Neville's works the in/PDR 27, and you hear him fumble ranges. That unfamiliarity actually helps. If anyone was tempted to goose the numbers, they wouldn't leave their learning curve on mic. We're now on the 5/10 scale, he says, then calls right at a half of a millirem at the best point, roughly 0.07 milliroentgens per hour, while background elsewhere rides 0.03 to 0.04. Not dangerous, but consistently higher at the center and on inward-facing tree abrasions. The pattern aligns with what they're pointing their flashlights at, not with an imagined hotspot. The 5-second flash rate gets a closer look. When the men face east over the field, you can count pulses with the tape counter. It holds true, but as they move and the light appears to lift and split, the timing scatters. There's 3 of them now, someone says. To a skeptic, those are stars, Sirius to the south, others low to the horizon, distorted by atmosphere. The tape doesn't name them. It logs the perception, apparent motion, duplications, then the claim of a beam. The transition from predictable cadence to irregular events is exactly the hinge the whole case swings on. Voice stress analysis is messy science, but patterns emerge. Halt's baseline is stoic. When he narrates the radiation sweep, he's almost bored. When the pencil appears, microquavers creep in. He keeps control, Rank does that, but you can hear his attention lock. That's a human marker that pairs with the observational turn, timing exercise to engagement report, and it pulls the listener's pulse up with a subtle contagion of stress. Gaps and jumps complicate timelines. Halt later said he started the recorder constantly to save tape. You can hear hard clicks where he pockets the machine, then brings it back. That explains why an hours-long outing fits into just over 18 minutes. It also creates room for speculation. Missing minutes invite stories. Battery? Tape flip? Deliberate edits? The simplest answer fits the device in his own words, conserving a 20-minute microcassette in the field. Still, the gaps land at inconvenient moments. When things get close, he preserves tape, then you're back in with breath already elevated. It feels like a cutaway at tension because it is. Analysts also note the incidental audio. Security radio traffic names people, bus tinza, security control, context that grounds the scene in base operations. There's even that stray burst of piano, an accidental over-record of his daughter at home later. It's the kind of spill that forensic folks love. You don't fake mundane error that way. You live with it because the original was a working note, not a performance tape. One detail that doesn't get enough attention, alignment calls. In line with the farmhouse, Halt says, fixing the flashing source on a known azimuth. That's the same line skeptics draw to Orfordness. The tape concedes it, and then moves beyond it as the observations change. He isn't arguing with a lighthouse. He's trying to keep up with a scene that departs from the lighthouse's behavior in their field of view. What about the beam language? Pencil isn't a flourish. It's consistent with multiple later recollections, narrow, selective, angled to ground. The tape captures the moment of designation, not a full geometry. But the coupling of a specific descriptor with a concurrent stress marker is hard to wave away as misread twinkle. Put it together, environment matches records, the 5-second cadence is present and logged. The team's physiological and verbal shifts align with claimed anomalies. Instrument readings show a modest, patterned uptick. The recorder's gaps are explainable by use, but unfortunately timed. It doesn't hand you an origin. It does lift the tape beyond campfire tale. You're left with a durable artifact, a deputy commander narrating in real time as a controlled timing exercise gives way to something he didn't expect, then trying, breath by breath, to hold the line between description and conclusion. Burroughs' injuries and the VA fight. From the start, John Burroughs talked less about lights and more about what his body did. He remembered the air tasting metallic, a pressure in his chest, and then later, the way time frayed at the edges. He couldn't hold the sequence cleanly. Minutes stretched, hours folded. It read like stress until it didn't. Because after the forest, his health didn't reset. Symptoms crept in over years. Cardiac trouble that came too soon, blackouts that didn't fit his age, a fatigue that felt like wet sand dragged behind his ribs. Doctors asked about exposure. To what? He was a security policeman posted to twin NATO bases in Suffolk during the last hard winter of 198. He mentioned Rendlesham. Often blank looks. Then the testing started. This part isn't about belief. It's paperwork. Burroughs filed a claim with the Department of Veterans Affairs for service-connected disability tied to an event that didn't have a neat name in the codebook. Unknown radiation exposure was the phrase his advocates leaned on. It sounded vague because it had to. Specifics were locked behind classification. He needed records from the night a deputy commander carried a microcassette into the forest and from the days around it. The agencies that held those records weren't eager to help. His attorneys pried anyway. The Veterans Affairs process is slow by design. You submit, you wait, you receive a denial, you appeal, you wait again. Meanwhile, your heart doesn't care about administrative tempo. Burroughs kept working the problem. He wasn't looking for a headline. He wanted coverage for procedures his doctors said he needed. When the file came back stamped inconclusive, he pushed for the documents that would make it conclusive. Then something rare happened. In 2015, the VA granted Burroughs disability benefits for a heart condition connected to service, and in doing so acknowledged his in-service exposure during the dates of the Rendlesham incident. The adjudication referenced classified records, as reported by mainstream outlets and case advocates. They didn't print details, they didn't have to. In bureaucratic language, the line stood out: exposure acknowledged, cause tied to duty, benefits approved. That decision didn't declare a UFO. It didn't even say radiation, in a way that satisfied curiosity. But it broke the stalemate that had kept his experience in the realm of anecdote. If you're the guy who walked into the trees and later can't climb a flight without stopping, the legal phrasing matters less than what it permits. Care paid for, treatment authorized. A record that says something happened to you while you wore the uniform. He'd been open about memory gaps from the start, a fact skeptics used to pry at his credibility. The irony is those gaps are exactly what you'd expect from a physiological hit. Acute stress, electromagnetic exposure, whatever label you prefer, layered over a cold night and adrenaline. The VA didn't certify a mechanism. They did certify the impact. According to advocates who saw the back and forth, the key was pinning the date, window, and location with enough precision that the classified material could be consulted without being revealed. Bentwaters / Woodbridge. Late December 198. Security police on duty. The paper trail that had stayed quiet long enough to feel imaginary finally brushed the edge of daylight. Not enough to read, just enough to touch. For Burroughs, that line on a government letterhead was both victory and reminder. Victory, because his case no longer depended on talk shows and conferences. Reminder, because the acknowledgement stopped just short of telling him what he'd been exposed to. He'd stand in front of microphones later and hold up the letter. You could hear two notes in his voice at once. Gratitude that someone in the system had listened, and frustration that the door had only opened a crack. Health fallout changes the stakes. It pulls the story out of the forest and into hospital corridors. It connects a deputy commander's calm narration, radiation readings, 5-second flashes, a pencil beam, to a veteran's chart across an ocean and a generation. And it adds a blunt question to the file. If a government office is willing to say in-service exposure for those dates, what, exactly, was in the air of Rendlesham Forest? Inside a WSA, what could be disabled? To grasp what those guards feared, you have to walk the weapons storage area in your head. Think concrete igloos in neat rows, twin fences with razor wire, motion sensors strung like nerves, buried lines that don't care about weather, and hardened comms that feed a control room where every bleep means something. It's layered on purpose. If one thing hiccups, another catches it. That's the doctrine. Start at the skin. The outer and inner fences are more than metal, they're circuits. Disturb a strand, you trip a zone. Between them is the sterile area, a corridor of ground scraped clean so footprints show, so vehicles can't hide. Towers at the corners, some with thermal, all with radios, stitch the perimeter into a single set of eyes. Patrols loop on schedules that aren't really schedules, varied enough to keep memory from becoming pattern. Now the nerves. You've got line sensors on fences, magnetic switches on gates, pressure pads under certain approaches that don't look like much until a foot hits them. Inside the igloos, environmental monitors track temperature and humidity, because munitions behave best when the air's right. That feeds into local alarm panels, glass-faced, segmented, unforgiving, and into the central system that logs and alerts. Radios pulse on dedicated net, repeaters pushing UHF across the compound, so no one is ever really out of earshot. Tie it together, and you get a system designed to resist failure by distribution. One line can go down, and you still see. One radio can die, and the guy next to you carries. The question the guards woke up to that night wasn't, what if something trips a sensor? It was, what if something silences the board without touching it? Electromagnetic interference isn't science fiction to these systems. Lightning throws fits into lines. Nearby transmitters can dissense a receiver. That's why shielding exists, why grounding straps lace panels to earth. But shielding is a best effort, not a guarantee. A focused RF pulse in the right band can swamp a front end and make a receiver deaf. A powerful field can induce currents where you don't want them, flip a bit, freeze a board, and then vanish like a cough. If your alarms blink dumb at the wrong instant, you've just learned how much your redundancy really covers. Think through paths. Fence intrusion lines are essentially long antennas if you treat them that way. Hit them with a tailored waveform and a zone could show noise, or nothing at all. Gate switches are simple, magnetic, binary, but their reporting lines feed logic. Enough induced noise and logic stalls. Radios are especially vulnerable at the user end. Saturate the front end, and you've turned a receiver into a warm brick. That's why the story of a guard keying his handset and getting hiss feels technical, not mystical. It's how radios fail under RF attack. You transmit into a swamp, you hear carrier die, you look at the sky like it owes you something. Inside the igloos, nobody is saying vault doors swung open. That's not how this reads. The whispered phrase is dead panels and frozen boards. Picture a supervisor slapping the side of a rack out of habit while watching LEDs sit like beads of ice. He knows it'll pass, almost everything does. He also knows that if someone could hold the freeze for minutes instead of seconds, he'd be on the phone explaining why his area was blind. Why no formal log of a blackout? Because if it didn't last, if it didn't escalate to a breach, the safest administrative frame is intermittent anomaly. Write that with a time and a zone, and it's a maintenance ticket. Link it to a light in the sky, and it becomes a report with consequences. In nuclear security, unforced escalations are their own sin. So the system encourages phrases that contain fire. Nuisance alarm, transient, corrected upon test. What would a determined actor test inside a WSA? Not the fences, that's old. They'd test response coherence. Can you talk to each other? Can your central board see what your tower sees? Can a pencil-thin source map, where your bodies are by the way your radios fail and your heads turn? They'd aim for timing, apply the effect, watch the pattern, release it, watch the recovery. You learn a lot about a heart by watching it skip. A human moment makes it plain. A young sergeant stands with a finger over a red switch he has never actually had to hit. He's rehearsed it 100 times in drills. Tonight, the panel under his hand feels wrong. No tone, no ready light, and a white line as narrow as a measuring tape slides across the concrete at his feet, pauses on the hasp, then moves on. He breathes out through his nose so no one hears his mouth shake. He doesn't hit the switch because the switch is a ritual and rituals need the board to answer. For 5 long breaths, the board doesn't. Even a brief disruption inside that compound is a strategic embarrassment. You don't need to blow anything up to prove a point. You need to show presence, control, and the ability to leave no bruise. That's why the story doesn't live in redacted schematics. It lives in the way men talk softer when they describe that night. They know what could be disabled. They also know how little time it would take. Reconstructing the breach, beams and men. Line up the moving parts and let them run together. On the forest side, Halt stands near the triangle of impressions with the recorder alive. He calls the cadence 5 seconds east in line with the farmhouse, then notes a lift, a split, and finally, the word that will hang over everything: pencil. Meanwhile, across the base grid, guards at the weapons storage area settle into their rotations. Radios on a steady hum, panel lights normal. Stakes land first in the WSA. If any light is more than a light, if any radio falls silent for reasons nobody can chalk up to weather, the response tree goes hard right. But this is the Cold War. Nobody wants to prove the worst unless they're forced. So men do what they always do, they watch. Correlate placement with time. One tower on the western corner marks the freshest track in the sterile zone. A rover near the inner fence is finishing a weapons check. A supervisor stands under the flood, eyes adjusting to the mesh of shadow and glare. Back in the trees, Halt's breath tightens. "It's coming this way," he says. On the compound's edge, a guard raises his head because something thin and white just crossed the concrete where there shouldn't be anything but dark. Details decide it. The beam isn't a spray, it's a seam. It falls like a ruler laid across the ground, 3 inches wide, bright enough to notice but narrow enough to miss if you blink. It moves, then stops, not on a random spot, but on the hasp of a service gate he checked an hour earlier. He keys the mic to call it in, and gets hiss. 2 beats. 3. Then nothing but his own breath in his ear. On the tape, Halt names direction, steadies his voice, and records what his eyes tell him. A tight shaft from the bright source angled down. In the WSA, a rover shifts 2 paces to the right, and the seam follows like a cat's eye. Panel's dead, the supervisor mutters, half to himself, half to the world, because the board in front of him isn't showing the zone blink it should show if a sensor is being touched. It's not showing anything at all. This is where human training collides with novelty. The young sergeant at the panel hovers over the red switch that kicks a higher alarm. Doctrine says don't escalate on uncertainty. Doctrine also says don't ignore anomalies. His finger floats an inch above the plastic. He waits for the board to answer back. It doesn't. Radio silence windows have a feel. It's not just absence, it's a presence of absence, a thickening. The rover tries a second net. Carrier rise, then collapse. He steps again. The seam pivots like it was tethered to his shadow. He's never seen light behave like that from a lighthouse 5 miles out, or from a truck, or from anything human he's been briefed on. Correlate phrases. On tape. There it is, pencil-like beam. In the compound, it's tagging the fence. The timing sits in the same block of minutes. You don't have a synchronized wall clock between a microcassette and 2 guards, but you've got the rhythm of the bass, and it fits. Forest attention spikes as compound attention spikes. Microstory. In a tower, a corporal counts under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, expecting the flash, and instead catches a sliver slide across the sterile zone at 4.5. He blinks it away, then sees it again at a different angle. He tries to call it, and hears a hollow tone like someone pinched the wire. Impact is measured in what doesn't happen. No alarm bleeds across the base. No klaxons. No spasmodic scramble. Control is demonstrated without a shot fired, but not by the people in uniform. The demonstration is the absence. Panels that don't speak for a handful of breaths, radios that hiss in tight windows, a light thin enough to say, "We can be precise," without ever leaving a mark a morning inspection can photograph. Map the movement paths. The rover's last 3 positions trace a triangle within the compound. The seam hits each after lag, like it's sampling. In the woods, Halt's team moves south of the original impressions, eyes up, counting seconds gone wrong. "There's 3 of them now," someone says, which is when the corporal in the tower thinks he can see a second narrow line farther out, and for a moment wonders if there are 2 sources. Then one vanishes. The question of warning rides under it. If this was a message, who was it addressed to? The men on the fence, or the people whose phones would ring if those men hit the red switch? The cleanest interpretation is the quietest. A controlled show for a command audience, routed through the nerves of people trained not to panic. Then, as quickly as it arrived, the effect releases. On tape, Halt's breath stretches back toward baseline. In the WSA, carrier clicks return like a door unlatching. The supervisor's board blinks once, twice, then returns to its calm, indifferent face. No blown fuses, no scorched isolators, no obvious fault. Just memory. He doesn't push the red switch. He takes his hand back and rubs his palm like he's warming it. He will tell no one in a way that creates a paper problem. But later, off shift, the story repeats with the same bones. A narrow beam, tracking bodies, silence where voices should be, panels that felt frozen, and the feeling of being seen. If it was a breach, it needed no gate. If it was a warning, it didn't care who admitted it out loud. Debriefs, NDAs, and official posture. After the tape and the night of beams and breath, morning brought fluorescent light, coffee that tasted like cardboard, and doors that closed with soft clicks. Debriefs ran by script. Who, where, when, what did you see, what did you do? The forms wanted boxes. The night refused boxes. Security police filed through rooms with low ceilings. A captain asked the same questions 3 ways, watching for drift. Unusual lights, men said, sticking to the phrase that didn't set off alarms. Some were told to write statements. Others were told to wait. Waiting felt like an answer. Then the papers slid across desks, non-disclosure agreements framed as routine. You've signed a dozen, sign one more. Don't discuss base security, response protocols, locations of sensors, anything that could aid an adversary. The incidents fit under that umbrella without being named. You didn't need UFO on paper to make silence binding. One airman says the tone wasn't threatening, just firm. Another remembers a different edge, a reminder that careers depend on discretion. Most didn't need the nudge. Nuclear work bakes quiet into the bones. You don't survive long if you narrate every anomaly you meet mid-watch. Across the street, British police had their own notes. Nothing unusual seen, lighthouse visible, indentations likely animals. The Suffolk Constabulary file, released years later, reads dry and practical. On the UK side, the Ministry of Defence took Halt's memo, Unexplained Lights, filed it, and according to the internal correspondence, decided the matter posed no defense significance. That phrase would trail the case like a stamp that never fades. Inside the American chain, the official posture matched the memo. Halt's typed caution kept the event inside manageable walls. Odd lights, modest radiation uptick, star-like objects, a beam observed from time to time. No claim of a penetration. No assertion that systems failed. No invitation to escalate. His boss, Colonel Ted Conrad, would later tell researcher David Clark that nothing resembling Halt's later descriptions was seen by the people he positioned to validate them. That's the line command held. Meanwhile, friendships buckled. Some night shift cops who'd ribbed each other days before now avoided eye contact in the chow hall. A few leaned in and whispered that beams had swept the bunkers and radios went to mush. Others warned quietly, don't say that where it can be heard. Everyone understood the stakes weren't just personal. 2 allied governments sat on this ground. Every adjective carried diplomatic weight. In June 2010, decades later, Halt signed an affidavit saying straight out that he believed the event was extraterrestrial and covered up, and that beams fell into the weapons storage area. Skeptics pounced on the gap between that and his 1981 memo. Supporters called it the unfiltered version of what the chain wouldn't let him write. Either way, the affidavit reopened old rooms. Some who'd kept to unusual lights felt exposed. Others felt vindicated. The split widened. FOIA requests began to orbit the case. On the UK side, the released mod file looked like correspondence, not investigation. On the US side, the most sensitive records lived behind black bars, or in places FOIA doesn't reach. The Halt Tape, out in the world by 1984 thanks to a copy from Colonel Sam Morgan, as documented by Ian Ridpath, became the surrogate for everything you couldn't get from a file cabinet. The NDAs did what NDAs do. They discouraged specifics. If you were going to talk, you talked around the edges, about breath catching on a cold night, about a light that seemed to look back, about a board that didn't answer for a few breaths. When television crews arrived years later, stories stretched to fit time slots. Some witnesses hardened into their lanes, others retreated, tired of choosing between ridicule and exploitation. The mod's public line stayed steady. No defense significance, no need to investigate in depth. It's tidy and also useful. If you never admit significance, you never owe detail. On the American side, the posture was silenced by architecture. Nuclear security absorbs anomalies, calls them transients, and moves on. That's how you keep a posture. But posture leaks. A VA decision in 2015 acknowledging John Burroughs' in-service exposure during those dates carved a quiet notch in the wall. It didn't overturn the official stance, it dented it. In offices where NDAs still sat in drawers, men who once watched a white seam tag a hasp wondered again what, exactly, they weren't supposed to say. Skepticism was seeded on purpose. Doubt protects institutions. It also isolates people. The story survived anyway, on a microcassette, in a restrained memo, in police logs that dismissed and in affidavits that insisted, and in the careful pauses of men who learned long ago that silence around nukes isn't just policy, it's survival. Sorting signal from noise, what holds up. If you've stayed with us this far, you've heard claims that pull in opposite directions. Quiet tape versus loud memories, careful memos versus dramatic affidavits. Now the hard part, what actually holds under scrutiny and what folds when you press it. Start with sources closest to the nights. The Halt Tape is solid ground. It captures real-time observation. 5-second flashing light aligned east near the farmhouse. Modest but patterned radiation uptick. About 0.07 milliroentgens per hour at the center against 0.03, 0.04 background. Tree abrasions facing inward. Later, pencil-like beams and breath spikes matching stress. It's messy in the human way, radio chatter, device fumbling, even accidental piano over record. But that's why it reads clean. It's a working note, not a performance. When facts drift in later years, the tape yanks them back. Halt's memo, dated January 13, 1981, is also durable, if restrained. Unexplained lights, triangle impressions, modest radiation readings, star-like objects low on the horizon, and a stream of light from time to time. It misdates by 2 days, likely fatigue, but otherwise tracks the tape. Importantly, it does not mention beams falling inside the weapons storage area. That omission matters. It narrows what the document itself can carry. The first night witness statements obtained years later, John Burroughs and Ed Cabansag, anchor the Lighthouse debate. They described chasing a distant beacon, later realized to align with Orfordness. Those are contemporaneous statements. They don't include a landed craft or symbols. That doesn't end the story, but it sets a baseline before memory and media reframe it. Now the claims that wobble. Jim Penniston's later account of physical contact and a binary download doesn't appear in any 198 documentation. His notebook exists, and he drew symbols, but the ASCII parse yielding exploration of humanity, with coordinates surfaces decades later. Analysts can force meaningful text out of many bit strings with flexible framing. Some coordinates resonate, others feel curated. It's not fraud by default, but the evidentiary chain is weak. As narrative, it's magnetic. As proof, it's fragile. What about beams at the WSA? We have converging recollections from guards, a narrow, tracking illumination, radios that went to hiss, panels that felt dead. We do not have an official log admitting a security system failure. Security culture and classification explain some silence, but explanation isn't evidence. Still, Halt's tape does record pencil-like beams and his voice tightening within the same time window. That correlation isn't confirmation, it's weight on the scale. Radiation? VN/PDR, 27 readings are modest and debated. Skeptics note the meter's limits and operator unfamiliarity. True, yet the pattern, higher at the center and on inward-facing abrasions, matches observation. It doesn't prove propulsion. It does rebut nothing there by showing something slightly above background where the men focused. Skeptical counters that hold up. The 5-second cadence matches Orfordness. The star-like objects could be bright stars. Sirius low to the south is plausible. Human perception at night is vulnerable to misjudged distance and motion. Those points are fair and should be carried forward. Where they fall short is explaining the reported narrow, ground-tagging beam behavior and synchronized radio hiccups at a secure compound. You can stretch optical effects only so far before they stop mapping to the details people repeat independently. Claims that sag under load. Radar tracks asserted years later without releasable records. Sweeping conspiracies that erase the mundane. Any narrative that requires every skeptic to be malicious and every witness infallible. The record is Messier. Colonel Ted Conrad later said nothing matched Halt's later descriptions. The Suffolk police logs say Lighthouse and Animals. The mod file shows a posture, not a probe. Meanwhile, a VA decision decades later acknowledges Burroughs' in-service exposure. Across those dates using classified material, linking consequence to time and place without naming cause. That line in a federal adjudication is hard to wave away. So what survives? A deputy commander's real-time tape of unusual lights with measured anomalies and a specific pencil descriptor. A careful memo that validates core events while omitting nuclear-adjacent claims. Early statements that place a lighthouse in the frame on night 1. Credible, if undocumented, guard recollections that rhyme with the tape's beam language. A pattern across other nuclear sites of lights near strategic assets paired with odd system behavior. And a veteran's health case conceded by the government as tied to service during the incident window. What fails? Late arriving elaborations that lack contemporaneous anchors. Grand unifying explanations that ignore inconvenient details. Confident technical claims without schematics, logs, or data. What remains in the middle is the uncomfortable core. Unknown lights behaved in ways that, at minimum, challenged trained observers and at maximum, hinted at controlled, selective interaction with ground targets. The lighthouse explains the cadence. It doesn't explain the pencil. The memo is cautious. It isn't dismissive. The tape is limited. It isn't empty. The guards weren't poets. Their stories still align on narrow beams, radio silence windows, and the feeling of being mapped. You don't need certainty to see significance. You need convergence where it counts. Here, the signal is the artifact you can play, the memo you can read, the statements that fix direction and timing, the medical ruling that ties a life to those nights, and the echo those facts find in the nuclear record elsewhere. Strip away the noise, and the case doesn't vanish. It gets smaller and sharper. Strategic message or field test. If you listen to the tape and walk the fence line in your head, you end up with a choice that won't sit still. Was that night a message or a test? Decoding intent isn't a hobby here. It changes how commanders read every anomaly that comes after. Frame 1. Deterrence by demonstration. You approach the asset, you show selective control, you leave no bruise. Halt describes a pencil beam and a stream of light from time to time. Guards recall a seam of light tagging a hasp and radios that go to hiss, then recover. That's the perfect length for a warning, seconds, not minutes. Enough to say we can, without forcing a response that would echo through NATO paperwork. If you wanted Bentwaters in Washington to grasp the off switch, you'd do it exactly like that, visible to those who matter, deniable to everyone else. Frame 2, systems probing. Not a message, a rehearsal. You map response times, the lag between a rover's step and a supervisor's call, the recovery time on a panel, the discipline in not hitting a red switch when feedback dies. You test the shielding on radios and fence lines. You learn which angles produce which failures. On Halt's tape, the cadence is predictable until it isn't, and the anomalies cluster when attention is highest. That's how a probe leverages focus. It feeds on where people are already looking. Patterns across nuclear sites don't decide the question, but they do nudge it. At Malmstrom, missiles fell offline nearly at once. The paperwork refuses a UFO link, but the shape simultaneity under stress rhymes with selective interference. At Loring and Minot, lights near storage areas brought alerts without clean captures. Approach, interfere, withdraw. If that's theater, it's well rehearsed. If it's testing, it's careful and cumulative. Commanders live in the space between those frames. Publicly, they can't admit either. You don't tell the press you've been warned by an unknown. You don't confess your fences can be mapped by a light. So the language stays conservative. no defense significance, unexplained lights. Meanwhile, privately, doctrines absorb lessons. You adjust comms hardening, you tweak patrol patterns, you add redundancy where you found gaps. The memo doesn't say it, the maintenance budget does. Here's the complication. Natural explanations cover pieces of the night. The 5-second flash lines up with Orfordness. Star-like objects low on the horizon can be stars. Those facts don't dissolve the pencil claim, they frame it. A good probe hides in the ordinary. A good demonstration borrows local light, so it doesn't look imported. If you're trying to make your work deniable, you wrap it in the lighthouse and the sky. What about intent read through people? Guards reported the scene tracking bodies. Not gates, not random dirt, but men. That feels like a message, because it's personal. It also feels like a calibration, because a moving human is a clean target to log. Halt's stress rises right when the ground is designated. That's where deterrence and testing meet. The place where you make a trained observer feel seen. Skeptics argue that motive talk is a trap. They're right to caution. You can't prosecute intent without an actor. But policy still needs a working hypothesis. If you assume message, you posture to show you understood, visible readiness, quiet upgrades, steady nerves. If you assume probe, you hunt for edges, spectrum monitoring, instrumented drills, rapid forensics on transient failures. The smart move is both at once. There's a third lens, internal red team. Some have suggested human intruders or deception exercises. The publicly available record doesn't support an admitted drill, and no official log ties a test to that window. The Suffolk police logs and mod file don't hint at a sanctioned run. If it was human, it was unlogged or foreign. That returns us to message versus probe, just with a different sender. So where do we land? The tape's language, pencil, stream of light, paired with converging guard recollections reads like a controlled display. The timing and restraint read like a diagnostic. Deterrence demonstration or systems probing isn't an either slash or, it's a therefore. Show the off switch, therefore map the network. Make the people in charge feel it, therefore learn what they do next. That's the logic that hangs on the fence and echoes through a microcassette. The human cost and unanswered calls. By New Year's 1981, the jokes had gone flat. The men who'd laughed about deer and drunken farmers found themselves waking at 2 a.m., listening for a radio click that wasn't there. One wife remembers pouring coffee in a quiet kitchen when her husband froze at the window and let the mug slip. It shattered against the sink. He didn't flinch at the noise. He was somewhere back in the dark, counting to 5 under his breath. Careers got edged, not ended. You don't get demoted for seeing unexplained lights, but you learn what not to. Say if you want the next stripe. A few leaned into silence, transferring out or quietly taking posts away from the fences. Others couldn't let it go. They showed up at reunions with the same story and the same gaps, then drove home with the same questions. Sleep got lighter. Startle responses got faster. It's one thing to leave a base, it's another to leave a night. Marriages carried it too. Holidays became tightrope acts. One partner trying to keep the table light, the other pulling toward a story nobody else wanted relived. Some families only learned the shape of it years later, when a letter from the VA arrived using language that didn't read like TV. In-service exposure, dates consistent with. It wasn't dramatic, it was bureaucratic, and somehow that hurt more because it suggested the thing they'd been living with was noticed in a file, just not explained. The paper trail is a map of pressure points. Freedom of information requests went out to the mod and came back as correspondence and polite shrugs. No defense significance. Requests to U.S. agencies were met with form letters and black bars. Where something should have been, you found a page count and a redaction code. You could infer where the most interesting pages had been by how thick the packet was and how light it felt in your hands. Some people wouldn't talk, even when the cameras offered redemption. They'd shake their heads and say they'd signed, or they'd say there was nothing to tell, and then mention a beam with their eyes on the floor. Others couldn't stop. They were the ones who stayed on the phone after interviews ended, breathing into a long pause, then adding one more detail they hadn't planned to say out loud. Every time they did, they worried they'd made someone else's life harder. There's a reason silence sticks to nuclear stories. It isn't just secrecy, it's protection. The people responsible for the ugliest part of our defense posture need to be able to say very little, very precisely. If they admit uncertainty in the wrong way, it becomes policy. If they admit certainty, it becomes a headline. So they carry it instead. The cost of that restraint shows up years later, in bitterness, in broken trust, and in the way friends learn to skirt one subject forever. Micro-stories accumulate. A retired tech keeps an old panel lamp in his garage, the kind that blinked green when systems were good. It doesn't work anymore, but he taps it when he walks by. A former tower guard refuses to camp with his kids. He doesn't like trees at his back. A man who once traced a seam of light with his eyes now checks the red LED on his home router 3 times before bed, waiting for it to hold steady. Documents surface at odd angles. A local police log that reads like a shrug. A memo that doesn't use the words people remember hearing in the cold. A VA adjudication letter that offers help without answers. You get edges and silhouettes, never the center. The missing files hurt, but the present ones, thin, cautious, incomplete, hurt differently. They're reminders that the story was seen, just not told in full. Why some won't talk makes sense when you step into their shoes. They signed things. They gave their word. They don't trust their memory not to betray them or someone else. Why others can't stop is the mirror. It isn't attention. It's an itch under scar tissue. Telling it is the only way the night feels real. Both types pay a price, one in isolation, the other in credibility taxed by time. What's left is a set of unanswered calls. Calls to offices that transfer you until the line dies. Calls to old colleagues who let it go to voicemail. Calls to mind, in the dark, for a frame that makes those minutes make sense. If the night by the bunkers was a warning, it was delivered to people who would never be allowed to answer it out loud. They kept watch anyway. They still do. And that's the sting. A quiet craft, if that's what it was, found the places where our loudest weapons go mute and showed it knew the path. The people who watched it do that learned what they weren't supposed to say. The rest of us are left reading between redactions and listening to a tape where breath tightens at the same moment a narrow beam is named. The file isn't closed. It just keeps getting thinner where it matters most. Resolution and broader meaning. A silent, precise presence near our noisiest deterrence isn't mythology. It's a pattern that teaches without speaking. Want the primary docs and deeper breakdowns? Watch the follow-up for the Halt Tape timeline, mod file pulls, and the VA adjudication trail, linked next. Subscribe to X-File Findings and turn on alerts so you don't miss the next release.